Welcome to the Financial Modeling Podcast, where we discuss the latest trends in financial modeling, from AI and machine learning to automation and model auditing. This is your number one source for financial modeling news, tips, and tricks with your host, Matthew Burnett.
Good morning and welcome to another Financial Modeling Podcast. My name is Matthew Burnett and I love Excel and financial modeling. This week's podcast is going to be focusing on infrastructure models. I love infrastructure finance models because they are complex, they have multiple different parts to them, and they are used in the financing of actual infrastructure that we as the public can use. Infrastructure models are typically separated into two distinct elements: a construction phase, when debt is drawn down but not repaid because there is no revenue to repay the debt, and an operations phase. I like infrastructure models because they are very cash oriented. They focus on cash flow and how much cash you have available in each period to repay your debt. To me, that's very realistic. In each period, I need to know that I've got the actual cash to pay my service providers, to pay my operations, my maintenance, and to service my debt. And it doesn't really matter how big my balance sheet is, cash is king when it comes to infrastructure and project finance models. This morning, joining us is Dario Musa. Dario is the head of infrastructure finance at Rand Merchant Bank. Thanks, Dario, for joining us on this podcast.
Thanks, Matthew.
So this podcast is all about infrastructure finance and financial modeling in infrastructure finance. And we're just going to talk about how the models are built and how they're used and what the shortfalls are. So the first question I've got for you is how important is financial modeling in a general banking environment?
Well, I think it's very important from the point of view of being able to forecast and run scenarios into a future of a deal and to understand how a financing can react to different macro and micro economic changes. So I would say it's pretty vital from a banking point of view, that the financial model is robust and plays an important role.
So you just touched on something quite important, and that it's a forecast. So a financial model is not 100% accurate. You can't predict the future. So how do you deal with that in your projects when the financial model doesn't necessarily predict exactly what's going to happen?
I think there's two parts. A financial model can include historical information, which is factual, and that can be used then to predict, future forecasts. And as you say, the forecasts are 100% of the time not going to reflect reality. But the way you deal with that is to build in buffers and mitigants and run scenarios of downsides and upsides, so you can get a sense of how the model reacts to different changes in parameters which are potentially likely to occur in future.
So obviously financial models have changed a lot, over the past 15 years. Have you seen any specific changes, or the financial models that you're seeing now, they're very similar to the ones that you worked on when you started as a banker?
I think generally they are similar in principle and concept. I haven't seen that much technological change other than, sort of seeing people using macros more. But to be honest, in an infrastructure finance sense, a pure model is a model without any macros, and is quite simple and easy and user-friendly and easy to understand. I think the more complicated people make models, the more prone to error they are.
Absolutely. So following on from that, what would you say are the three most important things, or it doesn't have to necessarily be three, but the most important things that you look for when somebody sends you a model?
I think ease of use and intuitive layout are important, so that anybody can pick up a model and can kind of understand where to find things and how things flow. That's key. And I guess other things to look for is does it have the in a project finance context, does it have the typical project finance parameters that people like to measure, like cover ratios, gearing, etc.
Just a quick one following on from that. Obviously, you've spoken about cover ratios. That's sometimes quite different to a corporate finance model, which is more focused on balance sheet ratios. What would you say is the biggest difference between a typical project finance model and one that might be seen somewhere else in the bank?
Well, I think the key difference between a corporate finance model and a project finance model is the length of time you're forecasting, right? So corporate loans are typically shorter, 3 to 5 years. Project loans are anywhere between, 10 to 25 years. So project finance models tend to be longer and more complex in the sense that they are built up from sort of grassroots assumptions that, and usually cover I guess an entity that's never existed before, that's going to start from scratch and start operating fresh, whereas a corporate model tends to rely a lot more on historical information and forecast going forward. But as I said, in a sort of much shorter time frame.
What are the key things from the financial models you've seen of your time? What are the key things that most people who build the models don't understand or just leave out or aren't grasping when it comes to how important the models are, or what should be in the models, or how they should be laid out?
I think generally, in terms of layout and being intuitive, it generally does come through properly, because it's usually copied from another model or from a previous model. But I think the key thing for me is that the ability to identify potential errors by looking at what the outputs look like versus what you expect the outputs to be, based on a given set of inputs. I mean, that is very important from a modeling point of view, in that the modeler should have the ability to zoom out and kind of take a look at the outputs and say, well, does that make sense? Is it what I was expecting, or is there an error somewhere?
So you touched on something quite important as well, which is the accuracy of the models. So how do you, when you're banking a deal, make sure a model's accurate? Is it from what you've spoken about now, that intuitive ability to say, hang on, something looks wrong here? Or how do you make sure that the models are actually accurate when you're banking these deals?
I think the first step is to verify and make sure you've got the right inputs, and they either tie back to reasonable or acceptable macroeconomic factors, or to documents, contracts that set out certain parameters. So that's step one. Step two is the arithmetic accuracy of the model, and that can be generally easily checked by a model auditor, which is usually always a CP to a project financing financial close. And then thirdly is just that intuitive check. So those three things together should give you enough comfort that the model is accurate.
Do you have any advice for young people who want to get into project finance, who want to build models or become financial modelers? Do you have any advice for them where they can perhaps get experience or on modeling infrastructure projects, or what they should do if they want to get into this world?
I think a firm grasp and understanding of how Microsoft Excel works is key, and absolute comfort with navigating and building and analyzing information in Excel is important. But then ultimately, you can do a number of project finance theoretical courses, but the best way to learn is on the job, when you're on a live deal, and you can see this thing evolving, and you can see what happens with the outputs once, when you get real inputs, real life inputs, and you can actually question things like inflation and interest rates, and growth rates and GDP, and that kind of thing. I think makes it a lot more relevant and a lot more easier to learn if you're on a live deal.
And the final question is a question that I often get asked, is that when you have a look at a project finance model that looks really complicated, and it's in Excel and sometimes they're macros, but infrastructure and financing infrastructure isn't necessarily a new thing. I mean, infrastructure goes back a long way. So how do people finance infrastructure, and how do they model it before the invention of Excel?
I think what people did was build in much larger buffers, and much larger room to move if things changed. Whereas the where models have evolved to have now allowed financing terms to be a lot tighter, and allowed these projects to be a lot more competitive because you can use complex modeling to model various scenarios, and you can actually hone down and get quite close to real life scenarios without having massive buffers for things that you can't predict or can't model or can't run a scenario on. So that's sort of the key difference, I think.
And just one more question. Have you seen that project finance models are more complicated for different types of technologies like wind or solar, or if it's a train, or is a project finance model just a project finance model regardless of the technology?
I think they're pretty much fundamentally the same. The crux of a project financing is cash flow. So the old adage of cash is king. Most models will also generate financial statements for you, like profit and loss and balance sheet and cash flow. But the key element in a project finance model is the ability to understand the cash flow waterfall. And that, by and large, is the same, whether it's a wind farm, a PV plant, a toll road, a railway, or a tank farm.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Dario. That was Dario Musa, the head of infrastructure finance at Rand Merchant Bank.